But we already start with the second panel of this conference. And in the first panel, we discussed the issues of why defense matters in the very widest sense, and it got into a couple of very detailed issues. Now, in the second panel, what we would like to do is to ask the practical questions as to what kind of practical steps could be taken. What is it that governments and elites, analysts, and those interested can do to improve the defense situation in NATO and in Europe in the widest sense? And for that we have 3 and hopefully soon 4 panelists. It is always difficult to moderate a panel after Judy moderated a panel because the Celtic kind of temperament that she brings to the job is something that I can't bring to the job as a Northern German kind of, different kind of breed, I guess. But I hope that we can bring enough juice here to the second panel as well and get a good, lively debate going. I would like to ask Alex Nichol to speak first to us, who's a senior fellow at IISS and focuses very much on defense and geoeconomics, which is an interesting mix and lineup. And I hope that he has brought us a couple of good practical ideas for the second panel. Alex, please.
Well, Jan, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm going to address this, picking up from Jamie Shea's point when he spoke earlier on, of the new member of Parliament who was much more interested in social issues than in defence, because presumably he or she saw defence as being pretty much of a disaster area. Politically, and not something you really want to be associated with. So I think if we really think that defence matters, then we've really got to try to engage that kind of politician in the debate about defence and in taking on the issues. And it seems to me, as this kind of second strand of what I'm going to say, that it's essential that we have closer cooperation in defence. If we have smaller defence budgets, we want to keep up our capabilities. Cooperation is the obvious way. And taking on the argument from the last session, I would stress that I'm not viewing this in any kind of theological way, but in a purely practical way. It doesn't really matter whether it's within NATO or the EU or any other way. If you're finding better ways to get better value out of your defence budgets and get better capabilities, then you're making progress. So the question is, have we really reached the point at which the decline in defence budgets is actually forcing cooperation to happen in a much more meaningful way? If it doesn't, then the fact is that Europe's main defence powers are just going to go on cutting back separately on what their armed forces can do, and then find that collectively they can really do a lot less than they used to. And smaller defence spenders may find that they really have little to contribute when crises come along. Everybody actually knows what needs to be done. It's been debated for decades, and there are good initiatives such as smart defence and pooling and sharing. The question is, how do you get real political impetus behind cooperation? I think there are 3 points that one could make that might try to get some leverage on this issue. The first is that I think we should really address the sovereignty issue head-on. The instinct for governments to protect domestic interests, whether political, military, industrial or technological, has always been the major barrier to genuine cooperation. For example, only a small number of European equipment programs are collaborative, and those that have been collaborative have not produced the best value. The General mentioned earlier, more versions of NH90 than there are countries buying it. The argument, if you have steadily dwindling capabilities, do you really still have sovereignty in the sense of control over your own future? The argument needs to be made more effectively that we're stronger as sovereign nations through cooperation and not weaker. So then, secondly, how do you seek to tackle this in the real world of politics? I think the key thing is to make positive arguments. If defence is cast as a declining world of lost jobs and diminishing underfunded armed forces, then it's not going to be very appealing for politicians to engage with. Instead, we need to use and to build on existing examples of cooperation and demonstrate their benefits. in spite of what I just said, there are examples of cooperation between armed forces. And let's not forget that NATO nations and partners have been working side by side in Afghanistan and elsewhere for years now. And there are also examples of successful joint procurements. Politicians need to understand that by making an investment in a new capability or a new project jointly with another country or countries, they will be able to develop new skills, new technologies that will generate jobs and give their country something to contribute to allies and partners in future military operations. So I'm talking here about making long-term investments in future capabilities. What we need to do is create positive arguments that politicians can buy into. The argument is that with cooperation, you can afford something that offers security and jobs, and without it, you can afford nothing. That kind of argument will certainly help to offset the sacrifices that will still have to be made because of defence cuts. I think I'll stop there. I have another point, but I think I'll stop there and let others speak. Thanks.
I would like to follow up very quickly. One of the things that you said early on in the very beginning of what you just presented, and that is the question, have you yet reached the point where cooperation becomes really imperative? My feeling is that, we always say that it's such a pity that the defense debate is about costs only these days. My feeling is it's not about costs at all, or at least not really enough. Because if you actually realize how much governments could save if they cooperated, but they're not doing it, then the costs argument is not really the argument that drives the debate. Is that roughly the point that you were trying to make?
The problem with savings is that, if you're a defense minister and you offer your finance minister savings, he's not going to say, okay, you can save that money, you can deploy it into another defence project. He's going to take the money, thank you very much. So it's really up to ministers of defence, I think, to really play a clever political game, to make, as I say, strong arguments that are good for jobs in the future, for jobs and capabilities. That on the one hand, it's jobs and technologies. On the other hand, it's you, as a prime minister or a president, when it comes to the next crisis, you're going to want to contribute something. What is it you're going to want to be able to contribute? If we keep on cutting willy-nilly, then we're actually not going to have any seat at the table. I think that's always a powerful argument for prime ministers and presidents.
Thank you very much. I now hand it over to Maria Eleni Koppa, member of the European Parliament. She's just in from...
If I may, I prefer to speak.
Yes, just in from a number of hearings, including hearings with the two American senators who are over here for damage control in the NSA affair. And I'm sure that was a specific pleasure for you. We're looking forward to what you bring to this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I recently had the honor of drafting, on behalf of the European Parliament, the report on common security and defence policy in view of the December summit, which is the first after many years to be devoted to security and defence. It's important. It's an important summit because it will be the first time nearly in 10 years that we'll seriously debate on defence. We had a discussion in 2008, but in fact it is 2003 when we had the European security strategy. So a real deep discussion, profound discussion on security and defence is long due. Defence matters is the motto also of the Security and Defence Committee of the Parliament. But it's not a popular argument, and especially it's a difficult argument for many politicians, especially in a pre-electoral year as the one we are going through. I could say that one of the reasons we have neglected CSDP for so long is, of course, that we had the luxury to afford to do so, as Europe has been chiefly a consumer of security. European security as such has been US-driven for a few decades, and we all know that we are security consumers. But as NATO was born with a motto to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, and as things are changing now, we need to reflect on this change and see where we are heading now. Another Europe is being born, and how it will look like depends on us. And this generation, I think, of politicians that work on defense will determine what Europe will look like even at this, on the defense field. The report starts with a commonsensical observation that together we can do more than each one by ourselves. The world is changing rapidly. The US pivot in the Pacific is not theoretical anymore. It's happening and it will continue to happen. Euro-Atlantic relations are under great strain, as you well also know. And the corresponding shift in the global balance of power will bring both tensions as well as new forms of cooperation. Asymmetrical threats are multiplying, and the major security risks are much beyond of what we used to consider as security threats. EU is faced with an unprecedented financial crisis that leads to budget cuts on defense that risk to slash our capacities. And we have to assume that together we can do more than individual states, but the framing of interoperability, let alone common planning, must be addressed sooner rather than later. Let me be clear, no one can become a security producer in the vicinity of the Middle East, North Africa, region between Suez and the Horn of Africa, not to mention the Caucasus and New Eastern Europe, without becoming also a security provider. And no one can speak about, for example, cybersecurity or illicit trafficking of all kinds, organized crime, without talking politics. The EU has to operate in 5 theaters: land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace, but up to now our presence does not have a solid European dimension, guaranteeing that we are more than the sum of our parts. What is absent up to now is a drastic rethink of our security, or even a reflection on our mental map. What is Europe and where are Europe's interests? We need to move fast, something resolutely un-European, in 2 directions: politically legitimizing a common security and developing common capacity, because we cannot longer take our security for granted. The report insists on the fact that we do not need a new treaty to do so. There are many articles of the treaty that are dormant, for example, PESCO, Permanent Cooperation, Article 44, that can give a mandate to individual member states to act, or the Startup Fund. The report suggests a rethink of CSDP on the basis of a white paper, which should, amongst other things, convincingly animate the mutual security guarantee foreseen by our treaties. If not, the Baltics or Poland will not feel that there is such thing as a common European destiny. Admittedly, security is now a much wider concept than it used to be. Cybersecurity, maritime security, energy security as a common defense framework for strategic infrastructure, including oil and gas, must be under consideration. This is the sort of thing we need to think about now, together, or each one will fend for himself. And this is a path we do not want to take. And to come back to what react to what Professor Nichols said, of course there are good ideas as smart defense or pooling and sharing, but having interviewed many military people, many EU officials, everybody admits that pooling is easy, sharing no, because for sharing you need trust, and trust there is none among European partners. One other point is European Defence Agency. I believe we need to stand behind the EDA, which should be more than a project coordinator in the framework of permanent structured cooperation, and become the point of reference in designing organic security. And this also entails a vision of what capacity we need to afford and what do we need to develop. And this means cooperation on defense, research and development. How we move on these objectives. It's not a politically neutral question. We would like to see strong small and medium enterprise engagement for the benefit of innovation, but also for the creation of jobs in consonance with the 2020 Agenda policy framework. There also needs to be some consolidation, but this can't happen and won't happen if we do not manage the transition using policy instruments such as the European Social Fund or the European Adjustment to Globalization Fund. And of course, we need to act on a common industrial policy in this respect. So, what do we expect from the December summit? We could expect a political commitment for the development of joint capabilities and joint operational infrastructure preferably with a mandate to the Commission to draw specific proposals in this respect. We could expect a commitment to coordination, if not integration, of procurement and R&D policies. We could be thinking of the fiscal dimension of this endeavour. We could at least hope for the animation of what has been decided upon, and we could hope for EDA to get a boost in terms of mandate and means. Above all else, we need to think about the roadmap and a process of monitoring its implementation. We cannot have a serious conversation on defence once a decade. To conclude, what we believe in the Parliament is that those who want to move ahead should have the possibility to do so without being blocked by those who are not interested in such a cooperation. In times of severe economic crisis, we have to do more with less. For that, we need cooperation, coordination, and building of trust, which, as I said, is not always there. We need to work closely with NATO in a relationship that guarantees the strategic autonomy of the decision-making process of each one of these organizations. There is no conflict and no competition. We can absolutely be complementary, being there when NATO is not always welcomed. EU, with its multiplicity of instruments, can be in many occasions more efficient than NATO. And of course, we cannot be everywhere, and we have to give high priority to our neighborhood. We would expect more or less. What is clear is that the world moves faster than our expectations, and this is something we are not for the moment capable of coming to terms with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would love to drill you on the trust issue, which is a really crucial issue here. But I have one quick other follow-up for you. Ambassador, welcome. Thanks for coming, Thomas. Great. Have a seat. Enjoy. Get a drink. I would like to follow up on something that has something to do with you being an elected parliamentarian. You obviously deal with your voters, with your electorate back home. And one of the big arguments inside NATO, but also inside the EU, is how do we sell it to voters who are notoriously kind of, tired of these kinds of things and don't see the purpose of spending so much money. What is your experience? Does addressing the electorate, the average voter out in the street, does that make sense to sell this issue? Or should we much rather focus, in your opinion, on elites, on drivers, on the smaller kind of group of people who are really interested in this? What's the more promising path? I think that's one of the things that PDD, the public diplomacy people in NATO, have been agonizing about a lot. So what's your take on this as a politician?
I think that we must address the citizens. And they must explain that internal and external security are, in fact, the same thing. And we are working for the everyday needs of our citizens. That it's not something external, something that is far away, but it's something that concerns their everyday life. I'm absolutely convinced that we have to speak to the electorate. We have to engage them in this big debate. Otherwise, if it's only at the elite level, will face many difficulties in the future. And during a phase of very high populism, it's very dangerous. We must explain the need for us to engage more in such a discussion. And for me, being a socialist, it's important to have it also in the agenda for the European elections. It's not a question for elites or only for military. It must be in the agenda of all mainstream political groups, I think.
Thank you. Very clear words. Now, in good old Danish tradition, Peter has already taken a starting position because actually, asked to deploy, but he's already there, which is great. Peter, I know that you have a couple of very good and controversial points to make. I mentioned this earlier that when the general spoke, that Denmark is in many ways a fantastic, interesting case of a change of a strategic culture over a relatively short period of time. And I know that you have a couple of Danish examples in your presentation for us, so please fire at will.
Yeah, I thought I'd better get up here quick, because now that Thomas has arrived, I can't speak for 10 minutes. Now that's a little too bad, of course. But anyway, now that I've sat here all morning listening to all the doom and gloom and, the defense budget is falling and the politicians don't know how to lead and it's all really bad and sad and NATO is probably going to, die and all that, I thought I'd try something different for a change. I thought I'd try and be a bit more optimistic. And I actually think that we have two things going for us, that if we actually play our cards right, we might actually be all right in the end. And I base my optimism on two things. And the first is, of course, the answer to the question that we are here today to discuss. What makes defense matter? And I think that my Norwegian colleague actually got it right in the first session. It's not more words, it's not strategic communication, it's not more elite debate. And the second part of the answer was provided by our Canadian colleague, who said actions talk louder than words. And I would absolutely agree with him. He also pointed out that when the Canadian forces were deployed and actually doing useful things that the public and the politicians could see, then defense spending went up. Same thing in Denmark. Since the mid-90s, early 90s, we've basically exhausted and run over our operational budget for international operations on each and every year. And each time our politicians have footed the bill. And the reason they do that is, of course, because they see they get value for money. So I would argue that if we talk about actions, and actions in the defense field, of course, means operations, then the key to actually turn this thing around is to actually do operations, do exercises, demonstrating the existence of our armed forces to our politicians, and of course also to our rivals and our enemies, so that they know that we are still around, that it might actually be a bad idea to annoy us too much. And if you go back and take a look at NATO history, its history has always been about operational needs. Deterrent operations and constant exercising during the Cold War to keep the Soviets at bay, peace enforcement in the Balkans during the 90s, counterinsurgency in the zeros, and I'm convinced, regardless of Jamie told us this morning, I usually agree with Jamie, but on this particular point, I actually don't think he's correct. I think that NATO will also in the future be driven by operational needs. And I think that Libya actually proves this point. It came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden our politicians were scrambling to come up with a response. As a default option, NATO was chosen because it was the only option around. Paris, in the style we also have heard in the first session, did not want NATO involved. They wanted to do a coalition thing with their great powers, and that was unacceptable to everybody else. And that's the reason why NATO was chosen, because that was the only way of doing it politically. And that's the second reason why I'm optimistic. There will be new operations. There will be new opportunities. Syria, Mali, Somalia, anti-piracy off the coast of Nigeria, the Central African Republic. That's just the usual suspects, and you probably have a few of your own. But I'm quite sure that we will have new operations. We might not get the ones that we predict and plan for, but we will get new opportunities to actually go out and do stuff. And the challenge for NATO is to actually, and especially its militaries, is to actually be ready when that crisis or new war comes up. Then they must be able to provide their political masters with usable military options. They should not spend their time emphasizing, oh, this is difficult and we shouldn't be doing that. Instead, they should present them with options that they can actually use and can be part of a solution to the crisis that appears on the horizon. And let me give you one of the examples from Denmark that was advertised before I started. When Libya appeared on the horizon, the Danish Air Force immediately seized this opportunity and went into overdrive as soon as the order came from our politicians to prepare for a potential deployment. So they immediately did away with the normal procedure that wouldn't allow you to fly fully armed across Europe. They made sure that they brought every available weapon system into theater to give themselves maximal flexibility. And they immediately began to bang on the doors of the commanders, demanding that they be put to good use. And initially the US was not too keen on letting the Danish pilots loose because they weren't quite sure what they were capable of. But as soon as they figured out that they were actually quite capable, then they got involved in all types of operations. And in the early stage, they even used their two reserve planes, even though they were not allowed to do so. And they told me not to say so please don't tell anyone. But that just goes to show that they really did their utmost to meet the brief that they had been given by their politicians. And in the end, 4 planes had dropped some 1,000 smart bombs. And I'm not making this point just, to boast about the Danish Air Force. My point is that the Danish Air Force was able to make a difference because it made the most of the opportunity when it came. It presented a very usable option to the Danish government, who wanted to make a swift and high-profile contribution to the coalition effort. And then let me give you another example from Denmark, and this time it's a negative one. For over 2 years, we had 2 Danish sailors that was held hostage by pirates operating off the coast of Somalia. And at no point in time during this period did the Danish military go up to their political masters and say, hey, we actually have a plan that can fix this problem. We can actually go down and rescue these guys if you want us to. It would have required calling in a few favors in Washington, but if we put our capabilities together in a creative manner, we could have done it. And I'm even told that the Americans actually did approach some of our representatives asking why we didn't want help. The reason why the military didn't do that, I'm sure, although I can't be certain, is because that would have made our politicians extremely uncomfortable, because it would have forced them to contemplate a mission that would have been difficult, fraught with political danger and military danger. And Danish ministers were very happy to reject calls for rescue operations, saying, oh, but the Danish forces can't do that because we don't have the capability to do so. And I think that the Danish military there missed an opportunity to demonstrate their usefulness to the Danish politicians. They could have presented them with a military option. The politicians would probably have rejected it, but then at least that they would have demonstrated their value and at least expanded the politicians' horizons to what military force can be used to achieve. So I would argue that instead of spending most of their time complaining about incompetent political leaders that lack vision and don't get defense and that they cut their budgets all the time, they should rather spend their time preparing for the next operation and the next opportunity to go out and show what they can actually do, because that will sell a lot more tickets. I think that successful missions remain the best argument for preserving your budget, and I don't think that further cuts can be avoided unless NATO as an organization enables its members to employ its forces in missions. So whether they're NATO missions, coalition missions, EU missions, or UN missions, that I don't think is that important. The key is that NATO and its militaries maintain their ability to provide these usable options to the politicians instead of saying, oh, we can't do that, that will require 100,000 men. So sorry, we can't do that, you cut my budget. Sorry, that was my sort of 5 minutes, and perhaps a bit more, but I'll happily shut up and let Thomas take over.
Peter, I have a quick follow-up also for you. You make a very strong case that the militaries themselves must sell their ability to solve problems, and then, they sell more tickets, as you said. That kind of assumes that the military has a relatively independent way of acting within a political system, and that it can actually offer itself in the way, as opposed to just reacting to what politicians tell them to do. Now, with that high level of independence in mind, should military officers, generals, admirals, the upper echelons, take a bigger role in the public debate? Because in most of our nations, the militaries are silent, right? Aren't they?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you look at some of the debates where If you look at some of the national debates in Europe and also in the US where they have been involved, it's usually because they complain about budget cuts, poor equipment, and negative things. What I'm actually suggesting is that they should actually spend their time not complaining so much in public, but perhaps behind closed doors, make the case that, hey, Minister, I can actually solve your problem. And I'm not saying that they should exceed their brief. I'm not saying they should undermine political control of the military, but I'm saying that they could show some initiative in demonstrating that they may actually have a solution that the politicians hadn't thought of.
All right. Thank you very much. Tomasz, it's on to you. Thanks for joining us. I know you were stuck in traffic. It's great to have you here on the panel for two reasons. There are many reasons, but two in particular. First of all, because you're such a great expert and you're now representing your country, and partly also because you're the reminder that, actually think tankers are not a hopeless species, but something useful can become of them. And it's great to have you here to be a living specimen of us actually being able to, being savable, if you will. We talked in the first panel about why defense matters, roughly, and in the second one about, what actual steps could be taken by the various players in the field. Maybe you can bring some additional ideas to the table.
Indeed, Jan, thank you for the generous introduction. There indeed is a life after think tanks, so let that be an encouraging to all of my colleagues from the think tank world who are thinking of getting out. First of all, apologies for being late. For those of you who have spent the day inside and don't know what's happening outside, there's a taxi strike on, so all of the tunnels leading to Brussels and the Petite Ceinture, the inner beltway for the non-Bruxellois among us, are cut off, so I apologize. But unlike the Secretary General, I don't get the blue light, the flashing light, so I was sitting in a traffic with the rest of us mere mortals. I did use my nearly 1 hour in a traffic. Pardon me? We should get the Danish Air Force in by heavy lift helicopters. I did use the 1 hour or so in the taxi and in a car to read up on the Twitter feed and to get a sense of what was discussed earlier today. When I couldn't be with you, we had one of them 3.5-hour NATO lunches on the future of the world and more specifically our forthcoming NATO summit. So what I wanted to do, what I thought I would do, is exactly what Peter did right before me, which is to jump straight in, give you my sense of why is it that we're having difficulties sustaining defense spending, and what do I think of some of the ideas that have been floated earlier today, and to do that as informally as I can in the hope of starting a discussion and rather than boring you with a long speech. It's been a long day. A number of things have already been said, and I am one of those rare ambassadors who don't believe that just because everything has been said, I need to repeat it simply because it hasn't been said by me. So, a few observations on the things said already with my 2 cents worth on why I think it may or may not work. I understand that Etienne de Duran, who may or may not be with us still, can't really see through the spotlights. There he is. Great to see you. Made an argument earlier today that it would help tremendously if we were more open about the state of the defense and of the armed forces as such, and as someone who is almost Nordic in his beliefs in transparency and the healing powers of sunlight, I'm inclined to agree that indeed the more we know about the real impact of the defense budget cuts on the readiness of the armed forces, and when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, the picture isn't pretty, it is rather ugly. I think the more we know about it, the more it helps. I agree. But Etienne, it will work, the argument will work up to a limit. The difficulty with the argument that you need to sort of drag the deficiencies of the armed forces out into the light and the public will act in horror and demand more spending is that it assumes that the public actually sees a useful role for the armed forces, that it actually believes that the armed forces need to be ready and armed and prepared for whatever threat is out there. And it is a reality, as my boss, Charles Grant, who I understand actually may be in a room, there's a separate CR event from my old think tank upstairs, used to say the difficulty, the trouble with Europe is that too many countries want to be like little Switzerlands, safe and ensconced in the midst of all of it and isolated from any danger. In a country like that, you're not going to have, and of course, as an ambassador, I'm not going to name names, but let me just say that in a hypothetical country like that, if you make the case that, even if you make the case that the armed forces may be underfunded, the public may well just shrug and say, so what, if it doesn't see the threat. I'm sure that Etienne would have pointed that out as well, but I thought it was a caveat worth mentioning. I'm more inclined to go with Jamie. Is Jamie still here, Shay, or has he left us already? Well, I understand he was here earlier, a dear friend of a long time ago, and now, of course, a colleague at NATO. I understand that he argued earlier that we need to be more open about not necessarily the state of the armed forces, but about the threats. And in some ways, presumably not his words, he's more of a diplomat than I am, but I think what he was arguing in a sense that is that we need to scare the publics into caring more about defense by being very open about the threats out there. Again, he's right to a great extent. I think this is where my own personal transition from the public world of a think tanker to the classified world of a NATO diplomat has been an eye-opener. This truly is a more dangerous world out there than one might think and assume. But of course, 2 important caveats to Jamie's argument as well. The first argument is, there's only so much information that you want to share openly with the public on the threats out there, because there's only so much you want to tell your enemies or your potential adversaries about what you know about their intentions and capabilities. The other trouble with that argument is that it's not enough to simply make the case that the world is a dangerous place in order to get the defense, to get the public to then rally around a higher support for defense and for defense spending, you also need to prove that you know what to do about those threats. This is where we run into trouble whenever we use that well-worn argument of unpredictability and uncertainty. You know the drill. Most of our defense ministries have made it before. The world is an unpredictable and uncertain place. Therefore, we need to stay sharp and stay ready. Well, the layman out there, and let's not underestimate the public's common sense, will think, okay, but how exactly do you respond to uncertainty? How do you fight uncertainty? How many tanks and how many missiles? And how do you quantify the helicopters you need to fight uncertainty? So the difficulty is we have done a poor job, and maybe it's a case of lack of imagination, maybe it's a case of a failure of communication, but I think we have done a poor job articulating how you actually respond militarily, and how do you link to armed forces and your defense budgets to some of the threats we talk about. At the end of the day, I suspect there'll be no single solution, no single prescription that'll be universally valid for the 28 EU or the 28 NATO member states as to how you fix public support for defense spending and how you fix defense budgets. And again, I need to make the important caveat, presumably made earlier today, that most of us, vast majority of us, have a serious problem with defense spending. Most of us are way below the 2% that NATO calls for, but not all, presumably. And of course, there are countries out here, even including in a room, that do spend at and above 2%. So please take that caveat the way it was offered, or the qualification the way it was offered. Not all of us. This argument doesn't concern all of us, but the reality is most of us do have difficulty with defense spending. There won't be a single solution. I think there will be different appeals that will work for different countries. When I think of what might work, and simply in our region, in Central Europe, you'll find that in some countries the appeals to pride and history may well work. Something we don't discuss often. Peter touched on it a little bit in a somewhat different way. But in some countries, especially ones with a long history and in which armed forces have been associated with nation building and the public can rally around as a source of national unity and a source of national pride, they are often the simple mere argument that we need to sustain our armed forces because they are what makes us what we are. They are the guarantor of unity. It's often enough to get to keep the defense spending at reasonable levels. That argument will not apply to many other countries like mine. We've reasonably new at about 20 years old, almost exactly 21 years old, and it's not going to be able to fall back on a source of a long, proud military tradition that Poland has. In other countries, however, you may be able to make or use the appeal to troops. In a different context, my U.S. colleague Doug Lute made the argument that in the United States, this was a discussion about how you get Congress to fund a particular piece of defense business. He said, in the United States, money follows troops. If you have troops in a place or in a particular part of the world, you can then make the argument that it's important to support them, and you cannot deny them. Politically, it's very bad to deny them the financial support they need. Hence, money follows troops. That is an argument that will work well in countries that hold their armed forces in high regard, that hold the well-being and safety of their armed forces in high regard. And I leave that to you to work out which ones those might be and which ones may have difficulties making that argument. So again, at the end of the day, no simple solution for all EU and NATO member states. And this is where studies of the sorts that the 8 think tanks have put together under the guise of the Defense Matters campaign, with, I understand, support from NATO, to put a plug for my colleagues and friends here from the Public Diplomacy Division, who I understand have put some money into that worthwhile exercise. This is where those studies really help. They should not be used and they should not be seen as something that will work universally across all NATO and EU member states. But what I hope those studies will produce is essentially a set of recipes that countries will pick and choose from. Each one of them will have to align with the prescriptions with their own national needs and with their own national situations. I hope what the leaders will do is take those studies, take some of those thoughts on how you rebuild support for defense spending, figure out which one might apply well or best in the individual national context, and try to apply it. At the end of the day, it all comes back to the word that presumably has been said many times before, and that's leadership. Somebody's got to make the case. You can have a sort of the best possible set of recipes and a million different studies on how you rebuild defense spending. Unless somebody gets up and makes the case for it, nothing will happen. So leadership, again, is the sine qua non. And at that, rather than repeating the mantra of leadership for the 15th time, I thought I'd rather stop and leave more time for questions and answers. Thank you, Anne.
Tomáš, I have a money question for you. Because you're representing a government, I can't spare you a money question. Secretary General Rasmussen in an interview said just recently that, after 14, after Afghanistan is over, resources will be freed up that we can then afterwards use to modernize the alliance and our armed forces. First of all, are there these resources that will be freed up after Afghanistan? And secondly, how can we ensure that they're not going to be absorbed as a peace dividend once more, but can be reinvested partially? Is there a smart answer to this, or are we facing another kind of, oops, it's over, thank God, let's spend it elsewhere?
Three-part answer, I don't know. The honest answer to the first question, will there be resources freed up? The answer is yes, but fewer than we think. The assumption that if we cut forces by, say, 80 or 90%, we're also going to cut expenses by 80 or 90% is simply false. As any military planner, operational planner, or professional soldier in the room will tell you, there are some preconditions, some prerequisites that you need to have in place for each mission, whether it's command, headquarters, whether it's your intelligence setup, that don't change much from whether you have a 200-strong contingent or 2,000-strong contingent in a room. So it isn't true that we're going to save an amount of money proportional to the amount of troops that we will cut. And we're thinking of, as no surprise, of a quite dramatic reduction after 2014. There will be savings, but they will not be on the order as some of the media would have us believe of the sort of 70 or 80% over today's levels. There will be savings. So I move on to your second question. How do we guarantee that they will be used to actually support modernization and to support readiness? Let's not forget that it isn't just about modernization. Yes, you're right, we need to reinvest some of it back into buying the equipment that has been worn out in Afghanistan. But how do we keep readiness is going to be another big issue we'll face after 2014. The dirty little secret is we've done very little exercising over the last 10 years because we didn't need to. Our armed forces have been engaged in a pretty intense combat in Afghanistan. There wasn't much point to actually doing additional exercising at home. We'll probably be doing a lot more of it as the operational tempo in Afghanistan winds down. And a lot of the money will not go to modernization. Will simply go to things like exercises, simply so that we can preserve the skills that we've built up over the past decade or so in Afghanistan. But if you want to dedicate some of it to modernization, what do you do? And how do you go about making sure the money stays there? You make it a political priority. Frankly, that's what the Secretary General, that's what others are trying to do by playing up the different capability initiatives. You make it clear to the governments and governments to each other that the expectation is that we don't take the foot off the gas pedal after 2014, that we don't take the money out of the system. You cannot mandate that, you cannot prescribe that, but you can create an expectation that that's what will happen, and you make it more difficult for some of the more lukewarm governments to back away from that expectation. It's at the end of the day, it is about peer pressure, and it's often in organizations like the EU and NATO that's the best and only tool you have.
Thanks, Tomáš. Before I start taking your questions, I have three reminders for you. First of all, please tweet on. We already have a pretty lively Twitter feed going on, and the hashtag is up there. And please continue the good work. There's a nice little debate out there, and that's very useful. Secondly, you have all received not NATO forms, but assessment forms in the beginning here at the conference site at the registration desk. Please fill them in and drop them there again when you're leaving or in between things. And then finally, and most importantly, you're all invited to a drinks reception after this panel ends at 6:10. So please stay with us, mingle some more, network some more, and get some booze and some food, I guess, afterwards. Now, up with your arms, please, for the second round of Q&A. This light is very much in my face, but I tried to figure out where you are. and I hope that I can take a first round of 2 or 3 questions perhaps, so please have your questions ready now. So do I see arms somewhere? It's actually quite scary because I don't see any arms, or am I overlooking them? We've exhausted them, that's unbelievable. There's one arm in the very end, there's a hero back there, that's very good. And then there's the second one here, brilliant, so we're getting this started. The gentleman in the back, and then over here to my left.
My name is Robert van der Roer. I used to cover NATO for 15 years, and now I'm a diplomatic commentator, independent, and a strategic consultant. The answer to the question, if it's a question, yes, defense matters. I think it's a good initiative to organize this event. But what will happen after this? What will happen out on the street? How are we going to reach the European public? Ambassador Valashek had some suggestions, appealing to pride and history. The European parliamentarians said, yes, we shouldn't address the elite, but the citizens. I would like to hear some. Let me give my personal assessment. I think European defense and NATO both need a marketing plan. And let's try to prevent that. What happens to NATO and European defense? What is happening to the European Union? What Stefan Lehne perfectly wrote, saving the euro and using the Europeans. How are we going to prevent that this will happen with our European and transatlantic defense? So I would like to invite all the panelists to come up with concrete proposals to prevent that and reach out to the public.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Please, over here.
Thank you. Thank you. Ludwig de Kamp from NATO headquarters. I have a question for Ms. Koppa. With regard to Europe, if you see the very important evolution of Europe over the last decades, inspired by the approach from Jean Monnet, who actually said we'll not build Europe from a grand design, but rather through projects and small achievements. Do you think this applies also in the defense domain? And what should be the balance at the summit you referred to between a grand design, perhaps a new strategy, or concrete projects that will move European defense forward?
All right, I don't see any further arms at this point, so please get your questions ready. But I will toss in another question myself here, and that is one that is for Peter, but also for everybody else here. Jamie said in his introductory remarks that he thinks that the militaries in the future will be less capable of making the case for themselves because they're less present in the public, they're smaller, and there's more, they're just, less voluminous in a way, and so it's going to be much harder for them to make a case, like a self-propelled case coming from the military itself. Now, Peter, you say that the military should make a much, much stronger case for itself. And I wonder whether there's perhaps a disconnect between the two arguments, or maybe I'm just getting this wrong. Our military is capable of making a case for themselves, both publicly but also behind closed doors, as you said, Peter. So we started with a marketing plan question, and then concrete projects, and then mine. Who wants to start perhaps here? Yes, Ms. Koppa, please.
I would like to react immediately to your question. So what do we expect from this summit? In fact, on the one side, it's the European Parliament with very high ambitions, which means that, for example, we shouldn't discuss defense ad hoc, but say at least one every 2 years there must be a European Council on Defense. We must have the Council of Ministers of Defense. We do not have one, in order to be able to discuss defense matters in a more periodical and constructive way. On the other hand, we had the first information from the European Council that say that the heads of states were not so keen on having the great project or the big ambition, but have a more technocratic discussion and decide only on some flagship projects. You are well aware of them: SATCOM, maritime surveillance, air-to-air refueling, single European sky and drones. So this is important. To decide on specific projects, it's crucial. But I think, especially when we are 6 months before the European election, we must explain exactly why defense matters, why it's important to citizens, and try to make CSDP more visible to the citizens in order exactly to make people understand why defense is important, and explain where we are heading to, why you have to move ahead on common defense and security policy. Because it's not clear for many people, and being a politician, and especially a socialist politician, and I insist because we socialists usually are very guilty discussing defense. And when I discuss about defense in my home country, it's not always easy. Because for many people, defense is NATO. And why do we need European defense? So we need a lot of debate, a lot of discussions like the one, conferences, to open up the debate to academics, think tank, politicians, and at the end of the day, to the citizens, through emissions and radios, TV, etc. So there is a road ahead. From the Parliament, we are very hopeful that we'll intrigue a debate, we'll have a roadmap, we'll have benchmarks on the decisions, but we'll see. It's not clear where we're heading, but from our side, we'll push very hard.
I have a quick follow-up for you. From my side, I had lots of discussions with various parliamentarians at the national level, various occasions over the last few years, and almost all of them, not on a podium like this, but in a private conversation, would at some point admit that, it's so difficult to talk to constituents about this. It's basically a vote-losing proposition. You mention this, you go to your electorates, you meet them in the office hours when you actually, and you bring this up, and their eyes glaze over, and they don't want to hear of this. Mm-hmm. Is it risky for you as a politician to bring it up?
It is, because as I say, it's not popular. Europe is in the middle of a very severe economic crisis. So when they hear defense, they think of budget defense. In fact, what do we have? We had severe budget cuts in practically all EU member states. We are in a situation where we have to do more with less resources. And even, for example, if I say I deplore the budget cuts, I'm attacked because I need time to explain that, yes, we must rationalize our budgets, but if it is to slash our capacity and the capacity to protect European citizens and explain this to them, then I think they can get it better, they get the whole picture better. So not feel guilty and discuss about defense, open up the debate. I think there we can gain the challenge.
All right, optimistic. So we have a marketing plan question. And I see very, very skeptical faces. I mean, we can't get a helicopter right. How can we sell NATO properly? Tomasz.
I'm not an advertising or marketing expert, so I'm reluctant to offer so great, shiny, pre-wrapped, packaged ideas on a proper campaign. But let me offer one observation. One of the reasons we're stuck with the defense budgets that we have is that the publics have essentially come to treat defense spending and defenses as an insurance policy. We feel deep in our bones it's important to have them because you never know. But we don't quite see what might happen, where the scenario, the situations where we might actually see them. So what do? Like with all insurance policies, we spend the bare minimum. Hand on heart, how many of us sat in our living rooms with a computer and figured, I'm going to add this and that to my insurance policy, and pay hundreds of thousands of euros for events that will probably never happen? We don't. We try to get away with it on a cheap and buy the bare minimum that we can get away with, and that's the way we treat defenses. What we need to do is change the way the public thinks about defenses, away from sort of the insurance policy to an investment. Something that actually pays off in return, and this is where some of the studies and some of the numbers produced by the think tanks associated with the Defense Matters campaign have been so useful, because they actually lay out the benefits and returns, and this is where I think may be more interesting in political terms as well as an argument. We've laid out the argument for the returns on your defense dollars or euros or kroner in terms of jobs, in terms of employment. They've also spelled out very clearly the cost of non-defense. What happens if you failed to invest into your defenses, and how much has been spent on what was the cost of some of the catastrophic events that were probably and could have been averted under different circumstances. And unless you hear those arguments, unless we get away from the mindset that the defense is something we spend the absolute bare minimum on, and unless we switch to the mindset that defense is something that actually does bring real returns, whether it's in terms of jobs or whether it's in terms of massive costs and disasters averted, I don't see how we ever get from the sort of 0.9% of GDP levels where we are today to where we really need to be.
Alex.
I'd like to sort of take issue a little bit with what's been said. I mean, it seems to me to be obvious that it's very dangerous to get too far away from your electorate in terms of what you do in the defence world, taking part in operations. And we've seen the disaster of the Iraq War, which a war that was engaged in massively against the popular will. And we've seen just recently the example of the Syrian votes in the UK and what would have been a vote in the United States, probably. And so that is obviously, you want to avoid the political disaster. But my question really is how much you actually need to engage the ordinary voter on defence issues right now. You can't really, it seems to me, manufacture it as an issue, that the ordinary voter is going to be much more interested in healthcare, education, all the other, especially in times of falling government spending. It seems to me that you need to make sure that people are informed. And, for example, the television programs that we've had in the United Kingdom about what our troops are doing in Afghanistan, I think, have been tremendously useful in helping people to understand what our forces are doing. People, therefore, seem to be not actively anti-defence. They expect their countries to be defended. So it seems to me that perhaps what really needs to be, the people that really need to be engaged are politicians at all levels, because they, after all, have been entrusted by voters to look after these things. I expect to be a disagreement immediately, but okay, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, it must be an elite-driven process, but the citizens must be on board. When I discuss CSDP, and this is maybe more particular about CSDP than NATO. CSDP has now 30 missions around the globe. 70% are civilian missions. For example, training of policemen in Palestine territories, or ULEX Kosovo, or border management in Libya. There are of course purely military missions like EU Atalanta, which again piracy. And I think by explaining the whole spectrum of missions and of possibilities concerning the common defense and security policy, you must make the citizens understand how important is this work done. Because we need a stable environment as Europe, we need to stabilize our neighborhood. And this is something that people, I think, citizens can understand. In fact, I must add to that as a security provider, we cannot be everywhere. EU cannot be a global security provider. It's not our role. That's not what we should do. But concerning the security of the neighborhood, we must be there, and this is something that we must communicate to our citizens and keep them on board. If it's only an elite-driven process, and it has nothing to do with the citizens, especially during an electoral year, then what Europe do we want to build? A big market? This is our vision about Europe. Without the citizens, there can be no European defense identity or security identity.
Just very briefly, I mean, mine was only a question of degree, really, of the balance here between whom you need to engage. That was basically my point.
Really quickly on this, because I think it's a really interesting debate. I want to push Maria a little bit, if I may. Are we sure that politicians are in touch with what the citizens want and how they think about defense? the general assumption that they don't, and therefore it's hard to make the case. And I agree completely with Alex. You got to work with the electorate you got. That's how democracy works. But I wonder if we're often right about assuming that the publics and the electorates are as skittish as we assume they are. Time and again, what one sees is a country taking casualties in operation. Every single government takes the responsibility for the troops, towards the troops and towards their soldiers very seriously. None of us want to see casualties. Some governments, hand on heart, take it too far in terms of risk aversion. And we've seen specific cases, you can go back in Afghanistan 10 years ago, where the publics have actually responded positively. If casualties had been taken as tragically occasionally happens, they rallied around the operation. There was an outpouring of patriotism. There was a sense of, wow, this country is engaged in something that matters. This country is doing something that means we're not just about our little bit of the world. We're not the provincial country that some think of us as we might occasionally be. We're engaged in something that's bigger than us. And I always, in those situations, I always wonder, do the politicians occasionally get it wrong? Are they tapping into this undercurrent of whatever you call it, patriotism, passion for soldiers, for troops, actively and rigorously enough?
This leads us to a very, very interesting question, that is how resilient or even accepting our publics actually are. Let me toss in two numbers from 4 years ago, from the German elections at the time, not the ones this year, but 4 years ago, where Germans were asked about, the German military's engagement in Afghanistan, and about 75% of the people said that they didn't like it, and that Germany really, shouldn't be there. But then they asked them afterwards how many of them found the issue important enough to actually base their election choice on that issue. And then about 2 to 3% said that it was important enough for them an issue to actually base their election choice on this. That's within the margin of error of these kinds of polls. So the message is we don't like it, but we also don't care. And the question is whether in that delta between we don't like it, but we also don't care, whether there's enough space for leadership. Some people say 2 to 3% say it's important enough. That's actually silent approval. People actually, on the surface will say no, but in reality they're actually, quite approving. I wonder whether there's more leadership material and more acceptance in our populations than we often think, also in these PDD debates, think that there actually is. But that's just a comment from my side. I've used this example a couple of times, so I'm sure some of you have heard this before, but I think it's a very striking number, and you find very similar numbers in other European countries as well. So I would like to take a couple more questions in from the audience.
To answer the question you
Viggo,
actually
sorry.
posed to me.
Oh my God.
Well,
I got into trouble here.
You basically posed a question, because you've probably all forgotten it now, whether there was a direct relationship between the shrinking size of the armed forces and their ability to make the case to the electorate and to their politicians as to why they were still relevant and why they should be used as a political tool. Well, take Denmark as an example. Never has the armed forces in modern history been smaller, and never has their ability to actually influence or at least show their relevance to the electorate and to make the case to their politicians been greater. So I don't think there's any direct line or causality between size and influence. And that brings me back to the answer to your question. How do this budgeting plan, it's too complex and too complicated, and you won't get the average guy or woman on the street to appeal, because that's back to Asa's point about you're talking too much. I still believe that the thing is to demonstrate relevance to practice. Each nation must pick an activity, an operation, an exercise pattern, what have you, that appeals to their national electorate. In France, it's going back to the old colonies and sorting them out, and I don't think France will run out of them anytime soon, so, they're all right. In Eastern Europe, you can always talk a bit about the Russians and walk up and down the border, and then they'll probably appeal to somebody as well. So I think that the trick here is to come up with activities that actually appeal to the electorate. And you see that time and again. There's quite a lot of support for doing anti-piracy things off the coast of Somalia. There was quite a lot of support for actually stopping what Gaddafi was up to on the outskirts of Benghazi. So it's a question of using your forces and demonstrating the relevance. And then this thing about whether the politicians get what's actually going on or the elites understand what's going on among the public. I can tell you what happened in Denmark when we started taking casualties in Afghanistan. And I haven't seen anyone who predicted that. The recruitment went through the roof. There's a direct relationship between the risk that our forces were exposed to and the guys wanting to go to Afghanistan to serve. So there are other things out there that actually still matters. It's not politically correct to say that war is actually appealing, but for some people it actually is.
It's very important. It seems to be this kind of sub-reality underneath all of those nice arguments that we've been practicing for the last few years. There is this rough reality. Partly what you've just said, but partly what you've also said at another occasion that I remember, that you said, there's really war enough for everybody, which means that, there's enough happening out there to keep us busy for quite some time to come, and we needn't really worry about any of this because reality will just drive us this way. It's going to be painful, but there's enough of reality out there. Is this maybe a
No, but
a
seriously,
point?
take Syria. They will stop fighting there at one stage. I don't think it'll be terribly hard to make the case to the European electorate. We need to go down there and help them do some peacekeeping, be it in an EU setting, an UN setting, or what have you. But I think it's quite easy to make that case. It certainly didn't strike me as particularly difficult to find the European forces to go to Lebanon after the war between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006. So it's a question of making the relevant case when it appears. And there's plenty of relevant cases to be made in Africa and elsewhere.
I'm sure that this must trigger some responses from the audience, hopefully, ideally. There's one arm going up all the way in the back there, the lady over there, and then... Is Terry? Oh, we're in trouble then. All right.
Hi, Terry Schultz with NPR and CBS. I just wanted to follow up on that point because every time a case comes up that we journalists are asking, is NATO going to get involved, there's a recoil from the entire headquarters. Oh, no, we have no plans to get involved is the mantra that comes out of the Secretary General constantly on issues like peacekeeping, on issues like even a protection force for the for OPCW arms inspectors. And so I think if NATO wants to become relevant, if NATO wants to be out there visibly doing things that citizens care about, it has to change its mindset on this and not constantly want to sit in HQ and say we're not getting involved because there's no UN mandate. You can't have it both ways. Want to be popular and have everybody want to throw money at you, and then say you don't want to get involved in situations that people would care about and wouldn't be a great risk to your armed forces. So that's not really a question. That's just a frustration that we have when you both want us to write about NATO. Both wants us to write about them doing things that people would support, but doesn't want to do anything.
Thanks, Terry. More frustrations, very welcome. This gentleman over here had the arm up very briefly. Yes, Victor. It's this gentleman up here. Please, can you? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity. I could repeat again. My name is Velizar Shauman of NATO Communication Information Agency, but the question is nothing to do with this agency. I'm a little bit confused from the discussion because my understanding is NATO was established to defend freedom of the free world. And it was enough strong argument for the success of NATO for the last more than 60 years. So yes, probably we have to find arguments that NATO, through development of capabilities or participating in operations, is bringing opportunities for employment or developing technology. But at the end of the day, NATO is about defending the freedom, and defense in NATO countries is about defending the freedom. Probably defense matters for totally different reasons in some other countries in the world, but we are from NATO countries. And for me, first and foremost, NATO is about defending the freedom. And in order to defend the freedom, we need capabilities, and we need command structure to be able to use these capabilities. And maybe it is very complex to be explained to the people. I don't think so. So we have to talk about this. And just to finish with asking the question, what is your opinion? Is NATO about defending the freedom, and our armed forces are about defending our freedom? And is our freedom the most important thing for us? Or there are many things that is probably quite difficult to explain because there are too many? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very tricky issue because, as you said, indeed, freedom is defined in very different ways. I have one question all the way in the back over there, and then final question here goes to the gentleman here in the midsection. All the way back.
Yes, thank you. Arthur Lobek is the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. Actually, the previous speaker very nearly took the words out of my mouth. I've been puzzled for a while now to observe this debate and note that nobody seems to notice what to me seems fairly obvious, that with an atrophy of missions and objectives, you inevitably get an atrophy of means. I think that sort of follows naturally from the logic of politics. And with this, I'd like to introduce the issue of Russia. Just to ask you what you think of Russia in this context. As an Estonian, my government pushes the line that NATO is predominantly, as the previous speaker said here as well, for the defense of freedom, for the defense of countries, well, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. There's no Polish representative here, I notice. Now, I fully understand that this is the kind of thing that, the argument serves the government well in Estonia. There's not a particular problem in Estonia about the 2% we spend of the GDP on defense. But my question would be, do you think that sort of line is helpful against the wider European context, where Russia obviously is seen as a potential strategic partner? Thank you.
Excellent. I think in psychology they call this the open window effect, that, the tricky stuff comes out just a few moments before the window closes. That's very, very good. We have one final question here in the midsection. This gentleman, Kelly, please, over here. You got the microphone already. All right, thanks.
Hello to everybody. My name is Leandro Di Natale. I work for the European Strategic Intelligence and Security Center here in Brussels. I would like to ask you, to all of you, a question, starting from a few facts. On Sunday, the Danish intelligence services said that around 80 Danish residents went to Syria to join the Islamist Sunni rebels fighting the al-Assad regime. The UK intelligence service say that around from 200 to 350 UK residents did the same. In Greece, at least 9 MPs were charged for belonging to a criminal organization because they are part of the third party in Greece, the Golden Dawn. In Slovakia, we know that a far-right extremist was elected as governor. And to end the circle, I'm Italian, and everybody knows the meaning of the Italian word mafia. So I would like to ask you, what are, in your opinion, what are the transnational security threats shape the future of NATO, of the EU, and are they shape the future? Thank you.
All right, very good. We have a pretty rich menu for the last round of answers. We have the statement about NATO can't have it both ways, wanting to be in demand but at the same time not feeling responsible. We have the question of defining and defending freedom and how that is different everywhere, and the question of Russia that was raised, and then the question of European Islamist fighters. I think that's a pretty good cross-cutting sections of some of the security worries that we have. I don't know who wants to start. Ms. Koppa, perhaps, and then Alec, and then we go down the line.
Thank you. I'll be brief. First of all, I start from the last point. The rise of far right in Europe is a real danger to freedom, and that combines very well with the other questions. I think the rise coming from Greece, where it's the third party in the country, as you said, with a double-digit percentage, and being a truly neo-Nazi formation with paramilitary organizations, this is a big danger for freedom. It's not only personal, but my profound fear is that in these European elections we'll have the most anti-European parliament ever, with the rise of the extremes, both right and left. And the challenges for everything we stand for our values, but also for the vision of a common future at the level of economy, defense, security, will be at risk, if not jeopardized. So we should not underestimate the fact that you mentioned. I think it's very important. And whether we're discussing economy, politics, institution, or defense, we must take this in consideration. Second point. Concerning Estonia, the relations between Estonia and Russia, and especially the cyber attack that Estonia got from the side of Russia, shows clearly first that now we have a multiplicity of risks which are not the traditional dangers and risks. And still there, even if we should not expect as a European continent an attack by arms but by another foreign country, there are other means by which we should protect our freedom. So I imagine yes is the answer to what you said. The objective is still and always to protect our values and our freedom, but it changes and it evolves with time. So what we need is keep in touch with this evolution and be ready to respond in the right way to the new risks and challenges. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. I think all of the issues that the gentleman raised there, they're no doubt they're extremely serious issues for governments to deal with as governments. And obviously intelligence agencies are very importantly involved in dealing with them. But he asked whether they should shape NATO, and I think the answer to that is no. Because for NATO we need to think of what are actually going to require military responses. And I think almost none of the things that he mentioned demand military responses. It goes back to what Jamie said earlier, which actually wasn't quite, I think, how Thomas interpreted it. I don't want to get into an argument about it, but I understood Jamie to say that we shouldn't try to consider every threat. We shouldn't try to deal with every threat. In my view, he wasn't exaggerating, saying we should exaggerate the threats. He was saying we should focus on the threats that are really dangerous and require military responses. At least that was my interpretation of it. He just said that the narrative for military forces should be about dealing with big situations, which I think is probably incontestable. So finally, just on what the lady said about NATO's reluctance to say that it's going to get involved, I think it can't get ahead of... as a former journalist, I share that frustration, not only with NATO, but NATO can't get ahead of its political masters. It has 28 political masters, and if we think back to Libya, suddenly NATO wasn't going to be involved, and then suddenly it was going to be involved, as Ludwig described earlier. Finally, I would say to that, who says NATO is not going to be involved in any operations after Afghanistan? Obviously NATO nations don't want to be, particularly, but Libya shows. Suddenly something happens, and operations can start again.
Yeah, let me start by the first question asked by the lady who was a bit frustrated about my fellow countrymen. Well, you're phoning the wrong guy. If you want to know whether NATO goes out and does stuff, you need to call London, Paris, and Washington. And if you get negative answers there, then you know what Anders will tell you. So I would start making calls somewhere else. As for the question posed by the Estonian gentleman, and to some extent also this question again about how do we justify capabilities and command structures, I sort of hinted at that. My answer to that: use them, and then the people will see it. And I have absolutely no problem with Estonia making the argument that we should worry more about the Russians, and that deterring Russians getting up to mischief again should be the primary task for the alliance. Just as I have no problems with the Americans or the French or the British making the case that we should, address problems further away from home in order to make sure that they don't come back to Europe again. The lovely thing about the alliance is that at the end of the day, if you want a credible security guarantee against the Russians, you sort of have to cater to the American interests here. So if I was sitting in Estonia, I would develop usable military options that would keep the Americans happy and engaged in Europe, so that you don't have to worry about the Russians. And if that means taking trips to Afghanistan or Somalia or what have you, I would pay that price. That's how it's going to work in the future as well. So, if we can just keep that bargain going, then I think the alliance will be here for a long time.
I'll keep it short and sweet because Peter has already done my job as NATO ambassador and said good things about NATO and defended it. Therefore, actually, I'll skip it and merely to answer the other set of questions on sort of the different arguments. They all had a common leitmotif, to use a wonderful word from Jan's native language. The leitmotif is, would that argument work? Would the appeal to patriotism work? Would the appeals to freedom work? The answer is, as Peter says, whatever works. The notion that we are 28 countries that can respond equally to some sort of universal appeal, it's a fantasy. We all have different narratives, we all have different histories, we all have different electorates, we have different politicians. Different arguments will work in different countries. So let's stop beating ourselves up over what, or asking ourselves, why wouldn't that argument work in your country? What would work in mine? Just every single, I hope that every single country and elites in every single country will take the time to figure out what might work in that particular context. The different think tanks have done their work. They have offered a few arguments. This wonderful panel and the ones before it have done their work. They've offered a lot more arguments that might work. It is now up to literally the elites, as much as we hate the word, and to the media, going back, to start laying out and testing which argument might work in different settings. There really isn't point in comparing, saying which argument might work better. We get into those debates occasionally at NATO, especially when we draft our communiques. And we get into these fights of how do you exactly justify that particular mission or another. They don't matter. The ministers and the heads of states go out of the room and they give completely different press conferences and use completely different statements in their press conferences. Why? Because they realize as national leaders, what matters is what appeals to the national electorates. That's exactly the common sense approach that we all ought to use.
If I may, because I saw you nodding violently when the question about freedom was raised in the first place. Can you give us half a sentence on this freedom issue and how that resonates in the debates inside NATO that you are part of?
Well, the reason I shook my head is precisely because I recognize it as a very powerful argument that worked wonders and still does in my own country. But again, that's a legacy of a historical path that other countries haven't shared and therefore would not respond to the argument in the same way. The simple reality in case of Estonia, case of Slovakia, case of Romania was that we saw NATO accession in the either late 1990s or early 2000s as not only a defense and military issue. To us, this was also about return to a certain community of values, a club of countries that ascribe to certain rules, certain principles, certain notions, rules and values that we felt we ought to have been a part of it, for the past 100 years. We denied membership in that club, if you will, and we saw in the NATO enlargement, NATO accession, from our perspective, a return to that community of values. So yes, freedom is a word that one associates very strongly with NATO in our part of the world. That's an argument that works fantastically well where I come from. It will work less well in Holland, but that's just the way the world works.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic because it's 6 on the dot. According to the program, this comes to an end now. I have to thank you for your time and for your dedication and for what you gave to us and for your questions as well. I will not give a complete wrap-up of this conference because, first of all, it's impossible, and secondly, it's not what's asked for. I'm sure that you are already saturated, but I would like to raise 3 points maybe to conclude this conference that I, from the many points that were made, would like to pick, very subjective, my own picks really as a Carnegie Europe observer of the debate. The first one is this interesting notion of national prestige, national identity as a factor in the debate. I wrote a blog about this, that national aspirations are maybe the key, and not talking about threats, but talking about what countries feel that they should be contributing and how they feel great about themselves and how that become a driver of the defense agenda. And it's interesting that both Jamie and some of our other panelists mentioned this. And I'm not sure that this is a sign of renationalization that we're talking about a lot in the European context, but it might actually be a healthy kind of reality check that this is actually what drives national behavior. When we're talking about national interests, prestige is often a very important point. Of course, it clashes a little bit with the little Switzerland argument that Thomas also made, that lots of Europeans don't have these aspirations and these ambitions. But in the end, I think every country, even those without a big policy agenda or a defense agenda, want to stand for something and have an issue of identity and how they define themselves as a player, and maybe that can be used a little more. That would be my first point. The second point is an interesting thing that happened in the first panel, and that was this transatlantic divide that we saw playing out in the first panel. It's not new. Of course, we've known this. It was, also not new that Canada has taken a very strong position in this transatlantic divide, and the loss of patience with the European counterparts a little bit. I think to a certain degree that's a healthy tension that we have there. We need this, especially as Europeans, as a check on our way of doing politics and our way of debating. But on the other side, I think it's also important, for our North American counterparts to realize that not all things that would be ideal, in a context and are probably easy sellable there, are as easily sellable over here. And that healthy tension can then turn into a bit of a destructive debate. And I think we need to find the balance on this one, also in the future debate about NATO. And then the third point is the point that Peter made, and made in various permutations in the third panel, which I think is very, very important, and that is that NATO will probably continue to be driven by operational needs. We tend to look at it from the other side, How can we save a NATO? How can we save a security debate now that the missions are gone? And how can we breathe life into something that is losing its purpose? That's the narrative, and that's been the narrative for almost 20 years. And yet we have been in business, in the last 20 years like we've never been in business before. And it's very likely, given the hotspots, on the planet, most of which are grouped around Europe in a wonderful little semicircle, that, there will be operations in the future. And that maybe part of this debate is also slightly artificial, and that we could have a healthier debate if we got back to this kind of assessment of what the next operations could actually be. These are the three things that I'd like to offer as a final statement. Very subjective, very selective from my perspective, but it's the privilege of the host to do this. Thank you very much for bearing with me for another couple of minutes. Thanks again for your patience, for staying here in great numbers throughout the day. It was a great pleasure. I would like to thank NATO PDD for the wonderful cooperation, for their great support for this conference, also the people from the Square who made this possible physically and logistically. And to all of you, have a great rest of the day and be very good multipliers for the good cause. Thank you very much and hope to see you again soon.